Good morning. Once, when I was in graduate school at Kansas State, I was tasked with taking a prospective student around on a campus visit. My good friend Ben and I showed her around, lots of limestone and buildings and young people. At some point, I must have let loose with a string of curse words. I don't remember. What I do remember is Ben looking at me and saying, "Jesus, Darren, you sound like a longshoreman sometimes." I was taken back. I was a bit ashamed even. It was really another event in a long line of moments where I was confronted with how I didn't belong where I was. Ben didn't know it, but he was right in a sense. My father was a sailor and a factory worker, and his frequent cursing on the front porch while drinking beer with my uncle was something to hear. I would say an art form. We've been discussing abundance today, and Aaron asked me to reflect on that with you. What I want to talk about is abundance that I wasn't always aware of, what I call, or what I've been taught to call, cultural capital. That is the social assets we have and deploy in our lives, the things we learn about in the places from where we come. Our cultural capital often signifies class, which is a taboo subject in our society. For me, when I went to university, I was the first in my family to do so. I didn't have the vocabulary for the place, didn't know what a broussard or a registrar was, didn't really know what a professor was. I had no idea about any of it. I lacked social capital of education. I wasn't aware of it, though. I didn't have the behaviors of that place either. I knew how to work, but I had no idea how to be a student, and I failed miserably that first year. Now I've spent many years working, teaching in a community college classroom, and I explicitly teach the language and ways of education to my students. It took me a long time to learn these, and even longer to understand how they're steeped in middle-class privilege. It's one of the reasons working class folks distrust professors. They don't see the work in the same way. How can the thinking and reading and writing, the intellectual labor, be the same as welding axles, stocking shelves? They're different labor, but they're both hard, I know. It's taken a long time to learn to value the abundance of social capital that comes from my working class background. After all, most of our culture doesn't privilege it at all. We privilege wealth and speaking properly, which is to say, like middle class white people. But there are moments where the abundance of where I came from is powerful. I remember back in graduate school changing an alternator for a colleague, for a fellow student. She had come from a place where there had always been money to have a mechanic do the work. She was surprised by how quickly I changed it. While I was at Kansas State, I rented a bedroom in a big old house from a guy who taught medieval French. And I'm not kidding, great guy. And his hobby was opera scholarship. Great guy. Well, so one day the wind blew off his screen door. He was trying to figure out who to call when I came down and took a couple of hours to fix and rehang the old door. He was amazed. So was I. He owned a house and didn't know how to keep it up. My dad would have been pretty disgusted. There would be swearing. But my good friend, the professor, knew a million things I didn't. It wasn't a question of what was better. It was more a matter of honoring the abundance of social and cultural capital that we both brought to the world. Later, that professor would help me navigate some bureaucratic nonsense at the university that I would have been helpless to manage. Returning to abundance. One definition of abundance is having monetary wealth. And so many of us pursue and privilege that. Our culture lauds it. And I know, honestly, that I really like having cable, and I really like being able to go to the bookstore whenever I want. But I want us to come to think about the abundance of cultural and social capital that comes from other places. Abundance can also mean an overflowing quantity. I ignored and didn't honor the quantity of knowledge and relationships my working class family gave me. I wanted something else, had really been taught to want something else. But as I've come to think about the abundance of my background rather than its scarcities, I've been much more effective as a teacher, a father, as a human being. Today, I reject the shame and desire to not mention my roots. I hesitate to ask anyone to do anything. I hesitate to give my opinion very often. I prefer, in fact, to be quiet. But in this moment, I ask you to see a wider conception of abundance, especially the cultural and social capital often overlooked and undervalued. For me, a more just and equitable world is one where we appreciate the variety of abundance.